For nearly 4 years, Russia held the Kinburn Spit. This week, its troops simply walked away, and Ukraine never had to land a single boat to take it. No beach assault, no close quarters fight on the dunes. Just an order passed quietly down the line to abandon the shoreline and pull back across the water toward Kherson. Think about what that means. A position Moscow fought to seize in the summer of 2022. A natural fortress ringed by water with the open sea guarding most of its flanks. The kind of ground that should cost an attacker dearly. And it changed hands without the attacker ever setting foot on it. So here is the question that should bother every officer watching this war. How do you lose a fortress that was never stormed? The answer is not on the beach. It is in something you cannot see from a map. Let's start where this story always has to start. On the map, find the southern coast of Ukraine. Trace the great river the Dnipro as it cuts down through the country and finally spills into the Black Sea. Right where the fresh water meets the salt, the coastline frays into a long, thin finger of sand. That finger is the Kinburn Spit. About 10 kilometers of bare dune and salt marsh, treeless flat with almost nothing on it taller than a man. Before the war, it was a nature reserve. Lagoons migratory birds, one of the last wild stretches of that coast. Now, zoom in closer. Look at how it connects to the rest of the world. The Spit sits at the western tip of the Kinburn Peninsula, and the peninsula hangs off the southern Russian-held bank of the river. There is only one way to reach it by land, a single narrow neck of ground running back east toward Kherson Oblast. Everything else around it is water, the Dnipro Bug estuary to the north, the open Black Sea to the south and west, one road in, water on every other side. Hold that picture because it is the whole story. For 4 years, that one feature one land corridor with water everywhere else was Russia's advantage. And this month, it became Russia's grave. Why did Moscow want this sliver of sand in the first place? Because of what sits within range of it. Whoever holds the Kinburn Spit holds the doorway to the mouth of the Dnipro. From those dunes, Russian guns and rocket launchers could reach the approaches to the Ukrainian ports, the town of Ochakiv just across the water, the shipping lanes feeding Mykolaiv, and beyond them the sea route toward Odessa. A few square kilometers of nothing, and yet from there you could threaten the maritime artery of southern Ukraine. Ukrainian commanders described Russian rocket systems on the Spit shelling Ochakiv on a regular basis. That is why the Spit mattered, not for the ground, for the reach. So Russia treated it like what it was, a forward dagger. It moved troops out onto the peninsula. It fortified. According to Ukraine's military intelligence and the spokesman for its southern defense forces, Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, Russia had been massing forces on Kinburn and the neighboring Tendra Spit for over a year, reinforcing, transferring defensive weapons, trying to lock down control of the river's mouth and its islands. Reports at one point had Russia gathering hundreds of small boats in the area, preparing landings, probing the Ukrainian-held bank of the Dnipro again and again. On paper, it was a strong hand. A garrison on a fortress of water pointing a knife at 3 cities. And for all that strength on paper, Russia could never quite turn the Spit into a springboard. Ukrainian officers reported repeated Russian attempts to land small groups on the river islands they held, and repeated failures. Months would pass without a single successful crossing. The dagger could threaten, it could not advance. But look at the same map again, and this time, think like the other side. Think like a Ukrainian planner sitting on the far bank. That one land corridor, the only way to feed the Spit, runs in plain view. The water all around it is not a moat that protects the defender. In this war, in this place, the water is a kill zone that belongs to Ukraine. And the flat, treeless ground that gives Russian gunners such a clear field of fire gives them no place at all to hide from what comes from above. Everything that made Kinburn a fortress for an army with secure supply lines made it a trap for an army without them. That is the shape of what happened here, not a battle in the usual sense, a geometry problem. Russia was holding the end of a long, thin straw, and Ukraine spent months working out how to pinch it shut without ever charging down the straw itself. This is the part the headlines miss when they count how many soldiers withdrew. The number of men is not the lesson. The lesson is the shape of the ground and what a modern military can now do to a position like this without spilling its own infantry onto the sand. So how do you strangle a fortress you refuse to assault? You go after the one thing it cannot live without. Here is what we actually know about the collapse and where it comes from. The first detailed account came not from a government, but from the underground. Atesh, the partisan and resistance network that runs agents inside Russian-occupied territory and inside Russian units, published a report through its cell tied to Russia's Dnipro grouping. According to that report, units of Russia's 337th Regiment began pulling back from the coastline of the Kinburn Spit, abandoning positions in the northern and western parts of the sandbar. Some accounts describe these as airborne troops. The public reporting simply calls them the 337th. Either way, the cause given was blunt. Significant personnel losses and supply that had stopped. Read the wording carefully because it is precise. The delivery of ammunition, fuel, and food to these units had, in Atish's words, completely halted. The fire teams could no longer cope with shooting down Ukrainian drones, and their casualties kept climbing. This was not a unit overrun in an assault. This was a unit that ran out of the things that keep a unit alive. A second detail in the same reporting matters even more, and we'll come back to it. Atesh said that a large part of this force had already been pulled away earlier, sent off to the Zaporizhzhia direction, leaving what remained on the Spit critically understaffed. No fresh manpower came to replace them. To plug the gaps, Russian commanders were reportedly shuffling small groups between positions, which only left fragmented, hollowed-out detachments strung along the sand. So that is the partisan account. What does the Ukrainian side say? The Ukrainians have been more careful in their public language, as they usually are about active operations. But the key claim lines up. For months, Colonel Voloshin and other Ukrainian officers have stated that their forces hold fire control over the waters and approaches around the Dnipro's mouth, that they can reach and strike movement in that zone. In recent days, Voloshin has described Ukrainian forces actively striking Russian movements and disrupting Russian logistics across the Dnipro axis, with the number of drone strikes in that sector rising to somewhere between 600 and 700 a day. Independent confirmation also came from Western analysts and outlets tracking the front, who noted that Russia appeared to be withdrawing from a strip of the left bank to escape Ukrainian artillery, and that Ukraine had effectively confirmed the pullback. Put the two accounts together and you get a consistent picture, even allowing for the fog of war. A Russian force on an exposed coastal position, a Ukrainian fire and drone net thrown across every route in, supplies drying up, losses from above that the defenders could not answer, and then the only decision left that wasn't simply dying in place: leave. It's worth being honest about the limits here. The first and most detailed source is a partisan network with an obvious stake in the story, so the sharpest specifics exactly which subunits, exactly how many, should be treated as claims, not gospel. Russia, as usual, has not narrated its own retreat, and even Ukrainian voices have noted something that cuts against any triumphalism. Because the Spit has no cover and is brutal to defend, Ukraine itself is unlikely to try to occupy and hold it now. This is not a flag-planting victory. Nobody is rushing to live on that sand, but that caveat is exactly what makes the event interesting, because the win here was never about taking the ground. It was about making the ground impossible to use, and on that the evidence is hard to argue with. a position Russia spent 4 years holding emptied out in a matter of days, and the reason given by every account points in the same direction. Not at a Ukrainian assault, but at a Ukrainian chokehold. Which brings us to the real subject of this video. Not the withdrawal, the method. How exactly do you seal off a piece of land surrounded by water when you are not willing to send your own men onto it? Because Russia had 3 ways to keep that garrison alive. By land, by sea, and by air. Ukraine closed all 3. Start with the land route. The one road in. Remember the geometry. To reach the Spit overland supplies have to travel down that single narrow neck of ground from the Kherson side. There is no second road. There is no detour. It is one thin corridor in the open with the Ukrainian-held bank sitting across the water within reach of it. In military terms, Ukraine did not need to occupy that corridor. It only needed to control it by fire. That phrase, fire control, is the quiet center of this whole story. It means Ukraine could put accurate fire on that ground whenever anything tried to move across it. A truck, a supply column, a relief party. You don't have to capture a road to close it. You only have to make crossing it cost more than it's worth. Stretch that over days and weeks, and the corridor stops being a supply line and becomes a place where supplies go to be destroyed. The straw is pinched. Nothing gets through. Now a defender who loses his land route still has options if he has the sea. And here, look at the water around Kinburn, because the water is the part most people get wrong. Instinct says an army surrounded by sea can be supplied by sea. Boats, barges, fast craft at night. For most of military history, that's true. But the Black Sea is no longer a Russian lake. Over the past 2 years, Ukraine, a country with almost no conventional navy, has driven Russia's Black Sea fleet out of much of its own theater using unmanned surface vessels. Drone boats. The Magura series run by Ukrainian military intelligence and the Sea Baby boats run by the security service. These are not toys. They have sunk Russian warships in open water. They forced the fleet to pull back from its main Crimean bases and shelter in eastern ports. By some assessments, Ukraine has destroyed or disabled around a third of that fleet without a single crewed warship of its own. So picture what a daylight resupply run to the Kinburn Spit looks like in that environment. A slow, low Russian boat loaded with ammunition and fuel crossing water that Ukrainian drone boats and reconnaissance already watch. It is not a supply mission. It is a target moving at the speed of a target. The same weapons that can hunt a corvette do not have trouble with a logistics launch. That leaves the air. The classic answer to a cut-off coastal pocket. Fly it in, helicopters low and fast, the way trapped garrisons have been kept breathing for 80 years. Except Ukraine has closed that door too, and this is the detail that should genuinely unsettle planners far beyond this war. On the last day of 2024, one of those Ukrainian drone boats shot down 2 Russian Mi-8 helicopters over the Black Sea using a small surface-to-air missile mounted on the vessel itself. It was the first time in history a sea drone killed a helicopter. The same family of boats has since reportedly downed fighter jets, so a Russian helicopter trying to run supplies low over that estuary isn't safe either. The air corridor that should have been the lifeline of last resort is itself inside the kill zone. Land sealed by fire, sea owned by drone boats, air hunted from the water and watched from above by FPVs. 3 vectors, all 3 closed. And once all 3 are closed, you don't need to defeat the garrison. You just wait. This is the mechanism, and it has a cold logic to it. A position like Kinburn produces nothing. No food grows on a salt flat. There's no fresh water to speak of, no fuel, no magazine of spare ammunition buried under the dunes. Every round, every ration, every liter has to be carried in from outside every single day. Stop the carrying and the clock starts. First, the ammunition thins, so the fire teams that are supposed to shoot down the drones can't keep up, which is exactly what Atesh described. Then the drones operate more freely, so casualties rise. Then food and fuel run low. There is no cover on that flat ground to hide from what's circling overhead. And there is no charge to repel, no enemy to grapple with, nothing to fight back against. Just hunger dwindling rounds and the sound of small engines in the sky. And watch how that loop actually runs, because the economics are brutal in one direction. A reconnaissance drone loiters overhead and finds something. A man moving between positions. A boat nosing toward the shore. A truck on the corridor. Then a cheap first-person view drone or a gun already ranged on the spot finishes it. An FPV costs a few $100s. The thing it kills a vehicle, a load of shells, a trained soldier, costs orders of magnitude more, and on a cutoff position it cannot be replaced at any price. The defender, meanwhile, burns through irreplaceable air defense rounds just trying to swat the cameras out of the sky, which is the exact failure Atish pointed to. The exchange rate runs one way every day, and there is nowhere to hide from it. On a flat salt spit with no tree line and no high ground, there is no position you can dig that the lens above cannot see. Movement is observed. Resupply is observed. Even pulling back the wounded is observed. The ground itself stops offering the one thing a defender needs most: concealment. That is the part worth sitting with. Call the men on that spit elite, call them airborne, some reports do. On that sandbar, it didn't matter. Courage doesn't reload an empty magazine. Training doesn't conjure food out of sand. The most disciplined soldier in the world, pinned on open ground with no supply and a drone overhead, is reduced to the same thing as any other soldier in that spot. A target waiting for a logistics decision made somewhere else. This is what modern siege looks like. Not ladders against walls, a line on a map severed, and a position left to digest itself. There's a deeper idea underneath it, and it's why this small event is worth a long look. Ukraine here is practicing something close to a pure form of what doctrine calls effect-based operations. The goal was never to physically clear the spit soldier by soldier at the cost of Ukrainian Marines wading ashore into prepared positions. The goal was to produce an effect, the collapse of supply, and let that effect do the clearing. Why pay in your own infantry's blood to take ground when you can make the ground untenable and let the enemy walk himself off it? And the lever that does all this is logistics, the unglamorous part of war. Not the assault, not the heroics, the lines on the map that carry fuel and bullets and bread. For 4 years on this spit, those lines were Russia's. The day they became Ukraine's, to cut the fate of everyone at the far end was sealed, no matter how good they were. Whoever owns the supply route owns the garrison. Kinburn is a small, brutal proof of it. So what does Kinburn actually tell us about what comes next? Let's be disciplined about this. Separate what's likely from what's hope on either side. Start with the most concrete signal, the one buried in the partisan report. Where did the missing men go? A large part of that garrison wasn't destroyed on the spit. It had already been peeled off earlier and sent toward Zaporizhzhia, toward the grinding fight around places like Orikhiv and Huliaipole. And nobody arrived to replace them. Read that carefully. It means the spit wasn't given up because it stopped mattering. It was hollowed out because Russia needed those bodies somewhere else and had nothing left in reserve to backfill. That is the tell, not a clever repositioning, a shortage. And reserve shortages are how fronts quietly come apart. Not in one dramatic break, but in 100 small subtractions like this one. A unit moved from a place that mattered to a place that mattered more, with nothing left behind it. Do that often enough and eventually you reach a place where the subtraction shows. Here's where I'd place my bet, and I'll tell you exactly what would prove me wrong. The most likely near-term outcome is the narrow one. Ukraine consolidates fire control over the mouth of the Dnipro. The immediate pressure on Oshakiv and the Mykolaiv shipping lanes eases because the rocket launchers that sat on that spit are gone. That's a real local gain. But Ukraine does not try to hold the sand itself. It has said as much, and the broader southern front does not suddenly cave. Kinburn in this version is a symptom of Russian overstretch, not the first domino of a collapse. Most likely that's what we're looking at. A clean, tactical win that improves Ukraine's position at the river's mouth and a Russian line that bends here but holds elsewhere. The bigger scenario, the one that would matter far beyond this estuary, depends on a single question. Can Ukraine repeat the trick? The Kinburn method works against any position that shares Kinburn's shape. Exposed, dependent on a thin supply line, and sitting inside the reach of drones and drone boats. Russia's entire southern posture runs along a coastal lateral the roads and rail that feed its grouping from Kherson Oblast east toward Zaporizhia and the land bridge to Crimea. If Ukraine's drone and fire net starts reliably reaching those lateral supply routes the way it reached the corridor to Kinburn, then Russia's southern defense stops being an offensive machine and starts being a brittle one. Holding ground it can no longer comfortably feed. That's the scenario Moscow has to fear. Not the loss of one sandbar, but the method going portable. And here's the honest other side, the condition that would prove this whole thesis wrong. Russia is adapting. British intelligence noted earlier this year that the Russian Navy is working hard on its own drone boats and on ways to counter Ukraine's. Russia has claimed kills against Ukrainian sea drones. If in the coming weeks, Russia manages to push its air defenses and counter-drone systems forward, reopen even one reliable supply vector, and either resupply or quietly reoccupy positions like this, then the lesson of Kinburn shrinks back down to a one-off. A local embarrassment rather than a template. The thesis here that control of the supply route now decides the fate of exposed positions regardless of the troops' quality lives or dies on whether Ukraine can do this again somewhere else. One data point is a story. Two is a pattern. We don't have the second yet. So I'm not going to give you a date because dates are how analysts get themselves laughed at. I'll give you a mechanism instead. The thing that emptied Kinburn was the severing of a supply line that couldn't be replaced. Watch for that same signature elsewhere on the southern front, and you'll know whether this was a single bad week for Russia or the opening of a much larger problem. So here's what to keep your eyes on. If the read in this video is right, the signs won't be dramatic. Watch for Russia trying and failing to push back across the mouth of the Dnipro. Watch for more units quietly pulled off the southern coast and fed into the Zaporizhia fight with nothing sent to replace them. Watch the daily count of Ukrainian drone strikes on that southern axis. If it keeps climbing past those 600 to 700 figures, the chokehold is tightening, not loosening. And watch whether any other exposed Russian position starts going quiet the same way Kinburn did. Not stormed, just starved. That's the tell. A fortress that falls without a shot fired at its walls. If you want to understand this war by how it actually works, the supply lines, the geometry, the machines, rather than by the noise, subscribe to War Room Insights. We don't sell you narratives here. We decode them. I'll see you at the next break in the line.